Hey everyone, and welcome back to Afrodo Reviews. On this channel, I help you decide, is that book worth reading of a second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? Hey everyone. So obviously, as you guys have noticed, the next couple videos are going to be a little bit different. I'm going to do them like I did that one period back in the day where I was using game footage as the background. Simply because I just really haven't had the time to sit down in front of my camera. Oh, okay, so I really haven't had the time or energy when I do have the time to sit down in front of my camera, set up all my recording equipment to get the normal stuff I got going on. So I'm just going to go ahead and do this, make it a little simpler on myself for a little bit until I get that time. I really don't want to do that thing I did last year where I spent weeks without updating because it took my channel forever to come back from that. Because the YouTube algorithm is an unforgiving thing. So, yeah. Today's book is The Night Ends with Fire. This book is a fantasy story published on July 2nd of 2024 by author KX Song. This is only her second novel within her lexicon, with a debut work coming out 2 years prior called An Echo in the City. Due to a relatively recent release date of this work, as will be common with all the books I've done this month, as many days as I have left of this month. So there's not much interesting details to share on the background of this book. So I'm just going to go ahead and skip straight to the report card. And move on to the cover. And what can I say, but I love this cover. Yeah, honestly, the only reason I read this book was because of this amazing cover. It's got a wonderful Chinese aesthetic to it, along with brilliant color. We see our main character, Mei Lin, standing before Phoenix, her sword drawn and basically showing the impossible odds she stands against. I also have one of the special edition books, where the pages have art on the side, giving them black borders, and much like my last book, removing the cover doesn't just give you a blank, boring book. In fact, the cover kind of hides a rather funny clue about the book. But before I get into that, let's read the synopsis. The three kingdoms are at war, but Mei Lin's father refuses to answer the imperial draft. Trapped by his opium addiction, he plans to sell Mei Lin. I'm pretty sure it's Mei Lin. For her dowry. But when Mei Lin discovers her husband to be another violent, ill-tempered man, she realizes that nothing will change for her unless she takes matters into her own hand. The very next day, she disguises herself as a boy and enlists in her father's place. In the army, Mei Lin's relentless hard work brings her recognition, friendship, and a growing closeness with Sky, a prince-turned-training partner. But has she simply exchanged one prison for another? As her kingdom barrels towards destruction, Mei Lin begins to have visions of a sea dragon spirit who offers her true power and freedom at a deadly price. With the future of the three kingdoms hanging in the balance, Mei Lin will need to decide whom to trust. Sky, who inspires her loyalty and love. The sea dragon spirit, who has his own murky agenda. Or an infuriating enemy prince who makes her question everything she once knew about her kingdom and about her own heart. So the synopsis is fairly decent. I will say it's a tad misleading because there's a couple points in here where it implies something is going to happen or implies something happened, but it doesn't, and that's getting more into the spoiler territory, so I'm gonna go ahead and cut it. I'm not gonna talk too much on this, but for the moment, the synopsis is okay. So we get into the review, and before we start, I do want to give something of an apology. Anyone who's been following my channel knows that I commonly review older works. In fact, I've made it no secret that when it comes to modern releases of any kind, I'm historically very well behind them. I can probably name 10 or so books I've read the same year they were released. And that they most commonly occurred because I started this channel and have been much more eagle-eyed in terms of books that have just come out than I normally am. The reason I bring this up is because when I reviewed my Repeat After Me book, I approached it like any normal review that I do. And that means I didn't worry too strongly about potentially spoiling the book for people. Normally, I think I brush off the times I forget to clarify this is a mostly spoiler-filled review channel, because I'm often reading books that have long been out enough that me spoiling it doesn't feel like it matters that strongly. Take, for example, City of Indra. Not only is that book at least a decade old at the time I reviewed it, but it was so bad I genuinely didn't feel bad for spoiling everything about it, because I don't think people should go read that. Or another example would be Eruption, the James Patty book that I just recently reviewed. Yes, it was released this year, but it was just another one of those James Patterson's make this into a movie schlockbuster book that, again, I couldn't really recommend anyone go read that either. So I didn't really worry about spoiling it for people. And like I said, it's one of those, it was so cliched that you could just, if you've seen a disaster movie before, you've read the book. So for anyone I unintentionally spoiled that book for who did want to read it, I do deeply apologize for that. And for this review and the rest of the November reviews that I have backlogged here, which the theme was supposed to be New November, I just never got out the TBR. I will be careful though. I'm going to start this review off as best with a non-spoilery review as I can. And then, if I need to, go into the spoiler section of the review. I'll be sure to properly mark it so you aren't being spoiled by accident. Okay, so the spoiler-free review starts right about now. The best way to sum up The Night Ends with Fire is basically to describe it as an edgy Mulan fanfiction.
Everyone says they want powers of dark magic, but no one wants to deal with the consequences. I'm Derek Darkblade.
Yeah, truth be told, that is the best way I can describe this book. And in the author's note on the back, Song more or less admits this is the case. She claims that she was angling for a more historically accurate Mulan retelling. Now, it's no real secret that when Disney takes old fairy tales and makes them into movies, they make them much less disturbing than they originally were. For example, Pocahontas. In the real-life historical story, she was 10 when her and John Smith met, and she was paraded around England for a year by her husband, who was actually John Rolfe, before dying a year later to unknown causes. Or a less depressing one, sadly, because at least it's not real, is the original Little Mermaid. Ariel suffered excruciating pain whenever she walked on her legs. Never truly earned the prince's love as an equal, as he seemed to see her much more like a pet than a lover. Kills the prince when he marries someone else, and eventually ends the story by turning into sea foam.
Alright, I'm gonna go cry.
Yeah, so it's not really a stretch to imagine that Disney's Mulan ending is probably not accurate to the original story. And Song does try to back this up by citing the Romance of Sui and Tang Dynasty's version of Fa Mulan, written by Chu Rin Hog, I think that's how you pronounce it, in 1695. That Mulan was summoned to become a concubine for the ruler of her nation, and instead of complying, self-terminated herself on her father's grave. But notably, that's the only example Song decides to offer in support of her point. She leaves out the fact that the earliest printed version of Mulan, thus the only one we can say for sure is the closest to the original myth, doesn't have that dark of an ending. You can read its entirety in like about 5 minutes, and when Mulan reveals herself to her comrades, they're shocked, but the story just points out that while they were in war, her gender did not matter. After all, but when the two hairs run side by side, how can you tell the female from the male? Now, I only bring this up because this comes to the crux of my point of this story being steeped in the idea that it's an edgy Mulan retelling. You can look at all the classic examples. Instead of her father being unable to answer the call himself due to an injury or be able to send a son in his place, he's just an opium addict who's avoiding the draft. Instead of Mulan, or in this case Mei Lin, there's not even that much difference between the names, going to join the army out of the impiety towards her father or to her country, she goes to avoid being sold off to an abusive husband to befund her father's addiction. Instead of Mulan just wishing to do her duty and return home, she begins to covet greater and greater accolades to recognize her skill and power. Because of that, the story gets a little predictable as you read it, as a lot of these stories adhere to Murphy's Law. As you read, you're vaguely aware that the author is trying to be dark and edgy. So when we get to certain moments, you just sit back and ask yourself, okay, well, the story has made a point of being dark and edgy now, so what's the worst that'll happen here? That's probably what's going to happen. And then you know what it is, because that's probably what the author's going to write. it's always going to be worst case scenario or something close to it, and it doesn't let up very much on that regard. And of course, it does read like a fanfiction at points, because there are clearly scenes from the book that you can tell were taken from the movies. These scenes feel tonally dissonant at times, and while reading them, all I could think about while I was reading them was,
I understood that reference.
Honestly, truth be told, admittedly, this comes off more like a fan fiction of the live action Mulan rather than the animated one. But maybe that's just because the live action one also tried to go for the more realistic vibe. Another issue I had with this book is that its time scale is way off. At several points, days or weeks would pass in the book, but it never truly felt like any time was passing at all. At one point, our character gives an exact number of days she spent in the scenario she's in, and I just had to frown because the number was so high, and yet, while reading it, I couldn't help but think that I didn't feel like any of that time had been passing. Because of that, the story feels like it's sprinting to its ending, rather than taking the time it needs to truly tell the tale it wants to tell. And these aren't scenes where they aren't necessarily important. Some of these pacing issues come up during what's supposed to be tense moments, where we learn things about our characters that help us see them in new lights. I also began to get incredibly frustrated with our main character, because she does the same exact thing that I got really pissed off at Daniel X for doing in his book. Namely, someone would repeatedly tell, or she'd repeatedly note a specific piece of information, but then later on would suddenly and act like that piece of information was suddenly a shocking revelation, as if the story hadn't already made it super plainly obvious, and that the average reader would probably be like, yeah, that's what that was pointing to. And I get this is aimed at young adults, but I think even as a young adult, I would have been like, yeah, obviously that's what that was. What did you think? There's probably maybe 2 twists in the entire book that didn't have giant neon signs over them saying, this is what's going to happen. And even then, I wouldn't necessarily say they were the best twists in the world. Whoa. I would love to go more into detail, but this is still the non-spoiler section, so I think the final non-spoiler critique I could potentially offer is that the story is trying to juggle too many characters at once. Because of that, it feels like certain characters get neglected by the story. Often, we're just told their personality and flaws rather than being shown them. Or other characters which are set up to have much bigger roles just get unceremoniously dropped halfway through, without any real conclusion to the story arc that was being built up with them. Because of that, all the time we see with that character and the effects they have on our main character's journey feels largely pointless by the end, especially since they don't seem to factor into the twist at the end. But I think this is about where I'm going to step out of the spoiler-free section and dive into spoilers. So, here we go. Anyone who doesn't want to be spoiled, here's your chance to go down, click the chapters, and move on. So, I think my personal favorite character in this book was Ming Lei, a prince in the opposing kingdom of Xingming. I say this because of the various characters introduced, he's one of the few that feels like he was genuinely realized, even as one half of the love triangle. He's a tragic character who clearly has his own hang-ups and opinions, but he's also one of the only characters that genuinely doesn't seem to look down on our protagonist, especially when he finds out her secret. Every other character basically turns on her when she reveals she's a woman, either staying firmly against her or eventually coming around, but only a couple days later. When Lei finds out, I never got the feeling that his opinion of Mei Lin changed. If anything, I think he gained new respect for her, even if he acts like he doesn't. I bring this up because the story ends with the whole Murphy's Law principle that I mentioned earlier. In the Disney version of Mulan, and indeed in the 12th century poem, Mulan reveals her true identity to her comrades without much punishment. Or any punishment at all, really. In the Disney version, Mulan is even rewarded in spite of her being a woman, treated as a warrior first and a woman second. Even Shan Yu, the villain of the movie, recognizes Mulan as the warrior of the mountain, not anything less.
The soldier from the mountains.
There's a version that song goes with can be easily figured out just by reading the synopsis. She goes with the fact that Mei Lin is outed by her best friend and her lover's bodyguard to the warlord. The warlord, instead of not caring about her gender, is deeply offended that a woman would dare get into his army, and orders Mei Lin to either be in prison for her whole life and go back to being the submissive woman underneath her father and then later sold to her husband. Mei Lin obviously chooses to be in prison because she doesn't see how the options are different, and at least going to prison allows her to stay herself. But we also later see that everything she accomplished is rewritten in history, so that she was just an ineffectual woman who got captured immediately, revealed top secret war information, and then later was in prison for it. Again, this ties back into my whole comment on how dark fantasy is just too predictable for my taste. Since most versions of Mulan end with her comrades at least accepting her, obviously the book was going to end with her comrades selling her out because they are that against her being a woman. The funny thing is that isn't even a twist really. One of the things I was going to compliment on this book at first was that Sparrow, who is clearly meant to be the stand-in for Yao, Ling, and Ching Po, was a pretty nice subversion, in that while he was a friendly, easygoing guy, he still had very sexist ideologies that was taught to him, and never at any point was this challenge for him. After a certain point, when you realize what this book is doing, you just realize that he's there so that instead of not only accepting Mei Lin for who she is, but then joining her and embracing femininity to save China, or, the fictional country in this world, he rejects all forms of camaraderie with her and turns her in for daring to be a woman. I think if Song wanted to make the twist a genuine shocker, she should have swapped the characters of Sparrow and Zhao Zeiling, because Sparrow is the narrow-minded best friend, so it would have been interesting to see him die before he knew the truth of Mei Lin. And then you have Zhao Zeilong in the book in Sparrow's place. Now, for the large portions of the book where he's alive, as he does die halfway through the book, he is treated as Mei Lin's rival. And not just in that she wants to surpass him, but he also sees her as an equal to his skill, clearly acknowledging it at several points. So I can see a character like that maybe getting offended that a woman was challenging him, since we never actually see them become friendly with each other, even though you get the hint they could have been friends if they weren't at opposing sides of their rivalry. So I think it would have been much worse if Zeilong has spent most of the book accepting Mei Lin as his rival and sort of friend, only to turn on her when he realizes she's a woman. It at least would have been more shocking, as we never really learned Zeilong's true feelings on women and their social standing. And this would come as a real gut punch because he regarded Rin, her male identity, as an equal in skill. So yeah, I guess that's my biggest complaint with this book, is that because it's dark fantasy, it just does the most obvious things possible in this book. And because of that, it's not that interesting of a read after a certain point. So I'm gonna go ahead and give this book a 5 out of 10. All in all, there isn't much else to say about this book other than it combines my dark fantasy critiques with my general critiques of fanfiction. Like I said, the story just feels like someone took an edgy Mulan fanfiction, specifically an edgy fanfiction of the 2020 version for some reason, and then sanded off just enough things to avoid copyright issues. It's not really terrible, all things considered, but it's hardly something that I would really recommend to go out of your way to read, gorgeous cover art aside. I honestly, I could get rid of this book, but I would keep the dust cover, because I really do like this cover art. This cover art's amazing. There's a lot of wasted potential right now, but the book does have a to be continued on the back. So maybe if a sequel does get made, it'll be a much better read. It'll be a little less predictable. It'll give a little more credence to the time variations, flesh out the characters a little more, that sort of thing. If you were to ask me, does this deserve Mount Doom? The honest answer is, not really. And that is a tough question, because this is one of those books that is going to have a very niche audience. You have to like dark fantasies, you have to be willing to look past the obvious Mulan elements right down to stolen scenes from the movie, and you have to be accepting of a book that almost feels like it dashes through what should have been important moments in its character building and world building. If that all appeals to you, or at the very least doesn't bother you, you'll probably enjoy this book much more than I did. But if those elements do bother you, you aren't going to like this book very much. So with that being said, just remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth having, even the bad ones. See you later, everyone.